The morning mist clung to the scarred landscape like a shroud, and through it, Private Thomas Mackinnon could see the impossible fortress that had broken the backs of two great armies. Vimy Ridge rose from the churned earth of northern France. Like a medieval castle, its 7-mile limestone escarpment bristling with machine gun nests, observation posts, and the mouths of countless tunnels that had swallowed whole battalions of French and British soldiers. It was April 6th, 1917, and Mackinnon pressed his mud-caked hands against the cold walls of the tunnel where he waited with 30,000 other men of the Canadian Corps. Above them, the German Fourth Army had turned Vimy Ridge into what their own commanders called the most impregnable position on the Western Front. For 2.5 years, it had remained unconquered, a symbol of German invincibility that looked down upon the Allied trenches with mechanical precision and deadly effectiveness. The statistics were staggering and well documented by military historians. The French had lost 150,000 men in their attempts to take the ridge in 1915. The British had sacrificed thousands more in their failed assault the following year. Now, it fell to the Canadians' 4 divisions, fighting together for the first time as a unified national force under the command of Lieutenant General Julian Byng and his Canadian protege, Major General Arthur Currie. What made this moment different was not just the men who waited in the tunnels, but the revolutionary approach they had taken to warfare itself. For months, the Canadians had been preparing with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Every soldier had been given detailed maps and models of their objectives. They had practiced their assaults on full-scale replicas built behind the lines, rehearsing their roles until they could execute them. Blindfolded, the artillery preparation had been unlike anything the war had seen. For a full week, Canadian and British guns had pounded the German positions with mathematical precision. Counter-battery fire had systematically eliminated German artillery pieces, while the massive howitzers had cratered the ridge's surface and collapsed tunnel systems that had taken years to construct. The bombardment was so intense that it could be heard in London. 200 miles away across the English Channel, in the tunnels, men from across the vast Canadian Dominion waited side by side. There were lumberjacks from British Columbia Prairie, farmers from Saskatchewan, fishermen from the Maritime Provinces, and factory workers from Ontario. Many had never seen each other's home provinces. They had forged bonds of brotherhood in the training camps of England and the trenches of France. The plan was audacious in its scope and revolutionary in its execution. The 4 Canadian divisions would advance simultaneously across the entire front, supported by a creeping barrage that would move forward in precise 100-yard increments every 3 minutes. It was a choreographed dance of destruction that required split-second timing and absolute coordination between artillery and infantry. As the minutes ticked toward 0 hour, set for 5:30 in the morning, Mackinnon could hear the massive guns adjusting their range. Preliminary bombardment was shifting from the German rear areas to the frontline trenches, signaling that the moment of truth was approaching. In a few hours, the maple leaf would either be planted on the summit of Vimy Ridge, or it would be buried beneath it alongside the hopes of a young nation seeking to prove itself on the world stage. The earth convulsed beneath their feet as if the very foundations of the world were coming apart. At precisely 5:30 on the morning of April 9th, 1917, the heavens erupted in a symphony of destruction that would echo through Canadian history forever. 874 guns opened fire simultaneously, the shells screaming overhead in a steel curtain that advanced methodically toward the German lines. Captain Robert Henderson of the 21st Battalion pressed his whistle to his lips and felt the vibration of the barrage in his chest. The creeping barrage was a masterpiece of military engineering, developed by the Canadian Corps Artillery Commander, Brigadier General Andrew McNaughton. Every gun had been surveyed to mathematical precision, every shell calculated to fall within yards of its intended target, as documented in the official war records. Held by the Canadian War Museum, this was the first time in military history that artillery and infantry had been coordinated with such scientific precision. The barrage would advance exactly 100 yards every 3 minutes, and the infantry would follow precisely 150 yards behind the falling shells. It was a deadly dance that required absolute trust between the gunners and the men who followed in their wake. The first wave went over the top into a world transformed by fire. The German frontline trenches, which had seemed so formidable in the pre-dawn darkness, were now nothing more than smoking craters filled with splintered wood and twisted steel. The wire entanglements that had channeled attacking forces into killing zones for 2 years had been cut to ribbons by the concentrated shell fire. Henderson led his men across no man's land with the steady pace of a drill instructor. The key to success was maintaining formation and keeping pace with the barrage. Too fast, and they would walk into their own artillery fire. Slow, and they would give the surviving Germans time to emerge from their deep bunkers and man their machine guns. The German resistance was fierce, but disorganized. The week-long bombardment had severed communications between the various strongpoints, leaving isolated garrisons to fight as independent units without central coordination. German machine gunners emerged from their concrete shelters to find Canadian soldiers already in their trenches. Having advanced under cover of the protective barrage, Private McKinnon found himself face to face with a young German soldier. No. Older than himself, both men frozen for a moment in mutual recognition of their shared humanity. The moment passed, and training took over. The German positions that had seemed so impregnable from a distance proved to be vulnerable to determined assault by men who knew exactly where they were going and what they needed to do. The Canadian advance was not without cost. The 2nd Division faced particularly heavy resistance at the northern end of the ridge, where German strongpoints had survived the bombardment. Major General Richard Turner's men paid a heavy price for every yard of ground, but they pressed forward with the grim determination that had become the hallmark of Canadian forces. By noon, the impossible was becoming reality. The maple leaf flag was flying from German positions that had been considered impregnable just hours before. The 1st and 2nd Divisions had secured the northern portion of the ridge, while the 3rd and 4th Divisions pressed their attack toward the heavily fortified village of Thielis and the commanding height known as Hill 145. The German High Command watched in growing alarm as their strongest defensive position crumbled before the systematic Canadian assault. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the German 6th Army, ordered immediate counterattacks, but his reserve divisions were caught in the open by the relentless Canadian artillery, which had been pre-registered on every likely assembly area. As the sun reached its zenith over the battlefield, it illuminated a scene that would have been unthinkable. At dawn, Canadian soldiers were advancing methodically up the slopes of Vimy Ridge, their objectives falling one by one to the coordinated assault that had been months in the planning and years in the hoping. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the battlefield as the Canadian advance reached the intermediate objectives that had been marked on their maps. With such meticulous care, what had begun as a coordinated assault by 30,000 men had now evolved into dozens of smaller battles. Each fought with the intensity of a personal vendetta against the machine gun nests and concrete bunkers that still held out against the tide of maple leaf shoulder patches. Sergeant William Morrison of the 42nd Battalion found himself leading a group of men from 3 different snup companies up the shell-torn slopes toward the village of Thielis. The original plan had called for the village to fall by 10 in the morning, but German resistance had been fiercer than expected. 6 hours into the battle, Morrison could see the shattered church spire that marked their objective still defiantly flying the black, white, and red flag of the German Empire. The fighting in Thielis was unlike anything the Canadians had experienced in their previous battles. The Germans had turned every house into a fortress, every cellar into a machine gun nest. The narrow streets channeled the attacking forces into killing zones where a single well-placed machine gun could hold up an entire company. Morrison's men had to fight for every doorway, every window, every pile of rubble that might conceal a sniper, according to records maintained by the Canadian Corps headquarters. The battle for Thielis represented one of the most intense urban combat scenarios faced by Canadian forces during the entire war. The village had been fortified over a period of 2 years, of interconnected tunnels and underground chambers that allowed German defenders to appear and disappear like ghosts in the ruins. Private James McLeod from Nova Scotia found himself in a surreal duel with a German sniper who had taken position in the church bell tower. For 20 minutes, the two men played a deadly game of cat and mouse among the rubble-strewn streets, each trying to anticipate the other's movements. MacLeod's victory came not from superior marksmanship, but from the patient fieldcraft he had learned hunting deer in the forests of Cape Breton. Meanwhile, the 4th Division under Major General David Watson was making steady progress toward the ultimate prize, Hill 145, the highest point on Vimy Ridge. This commanding height had been turned into a fortress complex that the Germans called the Pimple, a network of tunnels and bunkers that provided observation over the entire battlefield and artillery, positions far behind the Allied lines. The assault on Hill 145 required a different approach than the methodical advance that had characterized the morning's success. The hill's steep slopes and extensive fortifications made it impossible for the creeping barrage to provide effective cover. Instead, the Canadian attackers would have to rely on small unit tactics and individual initiative. Captain George Perks of the 5th Canadian Mounted Rifles led his men up the northwestern slope of the hill in a series of short rushes, from crater to crater. Each advance was covered by rifle fire from the men behind, a technique that had been perfected during months of training in England. Perks himself would later receive the Victoria Cross for his leadership during this phase of the battle. As evening approached, the Canadian Corps had achieved what 2 years of French and British attacks had failed to accomplish. The ridge was almost entirely in Canadian hands, with only Hill 145 and a few isolated strongpoints still holding out. The German Fourth Army, which had considered their position impregnable, was in full retreat toward their secondary defensive positions along the Oppy-Maricourt line. The cost had been significant, but far less than the carnage that had marked previous assaults on the ridge. Canadian casualties for the day totaled approximately 3,500 men, a fraction of the losses sustained by the French in their failed attempts 2 years earlier. The difference lay not just in better planning and preparation, but in the cohesive fighting spirit of men who saw themselves as representatives of a nation coming of age. As darkness fell over the battlefield, the men of the Canadian Corps prepared for the final phase of their assault. Hill 145 still loomed above them like a defiant fist raised against the sky. But they had come too far to stop now. The summit of Vimy Ridge was within reach, and with it, a victory that would define Canada's place in the world. Dawn on April 10th, 1917, broke gray and cold over Vimy Ridge, revealing a landscape transformed by 24 hours of the most intense combat the Canadian Corps had ever experienced. The ridge that had loomed so menacingly over the Allied lines for 2.5 years was now crowned with the maple leaf, save for one final defiant stronghold that glowered down at the Canadian positions like a wounded giant refusing to surrender. Hill 145, dubbed the Pimple by the Germans who had fortified it, remained the last obstacle between the Canadian Corps and complete victory. Major General David Watson's 4th Division had fought their way to within striking distance of the summit, but the final approaches were swept by machine gunfire from concrete bunkers that had been blasted into the solid rock of the hilltop. Lieutenant Colonel Ager Adamson of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry studied the German positions through his field glasses, noting the methodical placement of interlocking fields of fire that made a frontal assault suicidal. The Pimple was not just a hill. It was a fortress complex that had been engineered by some of the finest military minds in the German Empire, designed to be held by a few hundred men against divisions of attackers. The solution came from an unexpected source. Private Tommy Holmes, a coal miner from Nova Scotia, had spent the night exploring the German tunnel system that honeycombed the ridge. His knowledge of underground workings, gained in the mines of Cape Breton, revealed a weakness in the German defenses that trained military engineers had missed. A partially collapsed tunnel ran beneath the German positions, offering a route that would allow a small force to emerge behind the enemy lines. According to the detailed after-action reports filed by the 4th Division, the assault on Hill 145 represented one of the most innovative tactical solutions employed during the entire Vimy operation. The plan called for a coordinated attack from 3 directions, a frontal assault to fix the German defenders in place, a flanking movement around the northern slope, and the underground approach discovered by Holmes. Captain Harold McGill of the 42nd Battalion volunteered to lead the tunnel assault, taking with him 20 men armed with rifles, grenades, and the quiet courage that had brought them this far. The approach through the collapsed tunnel was a nightmare of broken concrete and twisted steel, made worse by the constant fear that the Germans might have mined the passages or left behind. Booby traps. The surface assault began at first light, with the remainder of the 4th Division advancing under cover of a concentrated artillery barrage. The German defenders, reduced to perhaps 200 men after the previous day's fighting, fought with the desperation of soldiers who knew they were making their final stand. Machine guns chattered from concrete emplacements, sending streams of bullets across the rocky approaches that had been cleared of all cover by 2 years of shell fire. McGill's underground force emerged from the tunnel system directly behind the UHL German command bunker, catching the defenders completely by surprise. The psychological impact was as devastating as the tactical advantage. German soldiers, who had been fighting with grim determination, suddenly found themselves attacked from behind by men who seemed to have materialized from the solid rock itself. The final phase of the battle for Hill 145 lasted less than an hour. Caught between the frontal assault and McGill's flanking force, the German defenders were overwhelmed by the coordinated attack. The last machine gun fell silent at 9:15 in the morning, and the maple leaf flag was planted. On the highest point of Vimy Ridge for the first time in the war, the victory was complete, but not without cost. The Canadian Corps had lost approximately 4,000 men in the 2-day battle, including some of the finest junior officers and non-commissioned officers in the Army. But they had achieved something that had eluded the combined efforts of the French and British armies for more than 2 years: the complete capture of Vimy Ridge and the destruction of the German 4th Army's strongest defensive position, as the survivors of the assault gathered on the summit of Hill 145. They could see for miles across the French countryside that had been hidden from Allied observation for so long. Ridge, that had been a symbol of German invincibility, was now a monument to Canadian courage and tactical innovation. The impossible had become reality, and a nation had found its voice in the thunder of the guns. The silence that followed the fall of Hill 145 was almost more unsettling than the thunder of artillery that had preceded it. For the first time in 2.5 years, the Canadian positions were not under observation from the commanding heights of Vimy Ridge. The German 4th Army, which had held this ground with such tenacity, was in full retreat toward their secondary defensive positions along the Hindenburg Line. Major General Arthur Currie, who had planned much of the tactical innovation that made the victory possible, stood on the summit of the ridge and surveyed the battlefield spread out below him. View was breathtaking in its scope and sobering in its implications. From this vantage point, German artillery observers had been able to direct fire on Allied positions with deadly accuracy, lacking any significant advance. Impossible until the ridge itself was captured. The material rewards of victory were substantial and immediately apparent. The Canadian Corps had captured 54 artillery pieces, including several of the massive howitzers that had made life miserable for Allied forces in the forward trenches. More importantly, they had taken 4,000 prisoners, including elements of 16 different German regiments that had been fed into the battle piecemeal as the High Command desperately tried to hold their strongest defensive position. According to intelligence reports compiled by the Canadian Corps headquarters, the German retreat from Vimy Ridge represented one of the most significant tactical withdrawals on the Western Front since the beginning of the war. The loss of the ridge forced the German High Command to abandon their entire defensive strategy for the Artois sector, pulling back to positions that were far less favorable both tactically and strategically. The human cost of the victory was sobering, but far less than anyone had dared hope. Canadian casualties totaled approximately 10,600 men over the 4 days of fighting, with 3,598 killed in action. While these numbers represented a significant sacrifice, they were a fraction of the losses sustained by the French. In their unsuccessful attempts to take the ridge in 1915, the efficiency of the Canadian assault was perhaps best illustrated By comparing it to previous Allied attacks on the same objective, the French had lost 150,000 men in their attempts to capture Vimy Ridge, while the British had sacrificed thousands more in their failed assault the following year. The Canadian Corps had achieved in 4 days what 2 great armies had failed to accomplish in 2 years of continuous effort. The strategic implications of the victory extended far beyond the tactical advantages of holding the high ground. Capture of Vimy Ridge represented the first major success for the Allied forces in 18 months of grinding warfare. It demonstrated that the German defensive system, which had seemed impregnable, could be broken by careful planning, innovative tactics, and the coordinated application of artillery and infantry. Perhaps more importantly for the men who fought there, the victory at Vimy Ridge marked the first time that all 4 divisions of the Canadian Corps had fought together as a unified national force. The maple leaf shoulder patches that had seemed like mere decoration in the training camps of England now carried the weight of proven valor on the battlefield. Canadians had fought as Canadians, not as colonial troops attached to British formations. The German High Command was quick to recognize the significance of their defeat. Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria, commanding the German Sixth Army, described the loss of Vimy Ridge as a catastrophe of the first order that would require a complete revision of German defensive strategy on the Western Front. The fortress that had been the cornerstone of German defenses in the Artois sector was now a monument to Canadian military prowess, as the men of the Canadian Corps consolidated their gains and prepared for the inevitable German counterattacks. They could take pride in having achieved something that would resonate far beyond the muddy trenches of northern France. They had proven that the Dominion of Canada was capable of independent military action on the world stage, and that Canadian soldiers could match the best that any nation could field. The victory at Vimy Ridge was more than a military success. It was a declaration of national identity that would shape Canada's relationship with the world. For generations to come, the weeks following the victory at Vimy Ridge transformed the Canadian Corps from a collection of colonial units into something entirely new, a national army that commanded respect from allies and enemies alike. The men who had stormed the ridge were no longer simply soldiers from the dominions overseas. They were Canadians who had proven themselves in the crucible of the world's greatest conflict. The international recognition was immediate and profound. Prime Minister David Lloyd George of Britain, addressing the House of Commons on April 13, 1917, declared that the Canadians have one imperishable glory, and that their victory represented one of the most remarkable achievements in the annals of warfare. French General Ferdinand Foch, who would later become Supreme Allied Commander, described the Canadian assault as a masterpiece of tactical planning and execution. The German reaction was equally telling. General Erich von Falkenhayn, former chief of the German General Staff, analyzed the Canadian victory in his post-war memoirs and concluded that the attack on Vimy Ridge represented a new form of warfare that combined scientific precision with aggressive spirit. The methodical preparation and innovative tactics employed by the Canadian Corps had set a new standard for military operations that would influence tactical thinking for decades to come. Back in Canada, the victory at Vimy Ridge was celebrated as a defining moment in the nation's history. Newspapers across the Dominion proclaimed that Canada had come of age on the battlefield, and that the sacrifice of the men who fought there had earned the country a place among the world's great powers. The Toronto Globe editorialized that the Maple Leaf now flies over ground that was won by Canadian courage and Canadian blood. The tactical innovations pioneered at Vimy Ridge were quickly adopted by other Allied forces. The coordination of artillery and infantry that had been perfected by the Canadian Corps became the standard for all major offensives for the remainder of the war. The meticulous planning and rehearsal that had characterized the Canadian preparation was copied by British, French, and American forces in their subsequent operations. Major General Arthur Currie, who had been promoted to command the Canadian Corps following the victory, found himself consulted by Allied commanders planning their own offensives. His emphasis on thorough preparation, detailed intelligence, and the integration of all arms became the foundation of what would later be known as modern combined arms warfare. The lessons learned at Vimy Ridge would influence military thinking. Well into the 21st century, the human dimension of the victory was equally significant. The men who had fought at Vimy Ridge carried with them a sense of national pride that transcended the provincial and regional divisions that had characterized Canadian society before the war. A lumberjack from British Columbia and a fisherman from Nova Scotia had fought side by side for a common cause, and their shared experience created bonds that would help unite the young Dominion. The memorial that would later be erected on the ridge captured this transformation perfectly. Designed by a Canadian sculptor Walter Seymour Award, the Vimy Memorial would become one of the most moving war memorials in the world. Its twin towers rising from the ridge like a testament to the sacrifice and achievement of the men who fought there. The memorial's inscription, "To the valor of their countrymen in the Great War," recognized that the victory at Vimy Ridge belonged not to any single province or region, but to all Canadians. The political implications of the victory were equally profound. The success at Vimy Ridge strengthened Prime Minister Robert Borden's hand in his negotiations with the British government over Canada's post-war status. The Dominion that had entered the war as a junior partner in the British Empire emerged from Vimy Ridge as a nation that had earned the right to an independent voice in international affairs. As the Canadian Corps prepared for the battles that lay ahead, they carried with them the knowledge that they had achieved something that would echo through Canadian history. The ridge that had broken the backs of French and British armies had fallen to Canadian arms, and in doing so had helped forge a national identity that would define Canada for generations to come. The victory at Vimy Ridge was more than a military triumph. It was the birth of a nation's confidence in itself and its place in the world. The guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, but the echoes of Vimy Ridge continued to reverberate through Canadian society and military thinking for decades to come. The victory that had seemed so impossible on that cold April morning in 1917 had become the foundation stone of Canadian national identity, symbol of what the young Dominion could achieve when its people united behind a common cause. The immediate aftermath of the war saw the Canadian Corps honored throughout the Allied world. The 4 divisions that had fought together at Vimy Ridge were invited to lead the victory parade in London. Their maple leaf shoulder patches now recognized as symbols of military excellence. King George V personally decorated the regimental colors of the Canadian units, acknowledging that their achievement had been worthy of the highest honors the British Empire could bestow. The statistical legacy of the battle was equally impressive. Military historians studying the engagement concluded that the Canadian assault on Vimy Ridge represented the most cost-effective offensive operation of the entire war. The ratio of ground gain to casualties suffered was unprecedented on the Western Front, where most attacks measured their success in hundreds of yards rather than miles. The Canadian Corps had advanced for miles in 4 days, a rate of progress that would not be matched by any other Allied force until the final months of the war. The tactical innovations pioneered at Vimy Ridge became the foundation of modern military doctrine. The coordination of artillery and infantry that had been perfected by the Canadian Corps influenced the development of combined arms warfare that would dominate military thinking throughout the 20th century. Staff colleges around the world studied the Canadian approach to planning and execution. Recognizing that the victory at Vimy Ridge had fundamentally changed the nature of modern warfare, Major General Arthur Currie, who had commanded the Canadian Corps during the battle, went on to become one of the most respected military thinkers of his generation. His emphasis on thorough preparation, detailed intelligence, and the integration of all arms became the standard for military operations in democratic armies. The principles he had developed at Vimy Ridge would influence Canadian military thinking. Through to world wars and beyond, the human legacy of the battle was perhaps even more significant than its tactical innovations. The men who had fought at Vimy Ridge returned to Canada with a sense of national pride that transcended the regional divisions that had characterized the Dominion before the war. They had proven that Canadians could achieve anything when they worked together, and their example inspired subsequent generations to meet the challenges of peace with the same determination they had shown in war. The Vimy Memorial, unveiled in 1936, became a pilgrimage site for Canadians seeking to understand their national identity The memorial's towering figures, carved from stone quarried from the ridge itself, spoke to the sacrifice and achievement of the men who had fought there. The inscription of the names of 11,000 Canadian soldiers who had no known grave served as a reminder of the price that had been paid for the victory. The political transformation that began at Vimy Ridge culminated in the Balfour Declaration of 1926. The Dominions as equals within the British Commonwealth. The confidence that Canada had gained on the battlefield translated into a new assertiveness in international affairs. As the Dominion that had entered the war as a colony emerged as an independent nation with its own voice in world affairs, the cultural impact of Vimy Ridge extended far beyond military and political spheres. Canadian artists, writers, and musicians drew inspiration from the victory, creating works that celebrated the achievement while acknowledging its cost. The battle became a touchstone for Canadian identity, a shared experience that bound the nation together across vast distances and cultural differences. As the 20th century progressed, the legacy of Vimy Ridge continued to influence Canadian military doctrine and national character. The Canadian Armed Forces maintained the traditions and standards established by the Canadian Corps, while the nation as a whole drew strength from the knowledge that its citizens had achieved something truly remarkable on the world stage. Victory at Vimy Ridge had proven that Canada was more than the sum of its parts, that the young Dominion possessed the courage, skill, and determination to meet any challenge. The ridge that had seemed so impossible to capture had become a symbol of Canadian potential, a reminder that there were no limits to what the nation could achieve when its people worked together toward a common goal. In the end, Vimy Ridge had given Canada more than a military victory. It had given the nation a sense of itself that would endure for generations to come.